The last time anyone saw Emily Carter, she was stepping out of Pine Hollow Diner just before midnight, her faded blue backpack slung over one shoulder and her phone in her hand. She had just finished her usual late-night shift, chatting with her coworker Jamie about weekend plans before heading out into the cool September night. The security camera captured her walking toward the parking lot, the dim glow of the diner's neon sign flickering behind her. But after that, she was gone. The next morning, Hannah Reynolds, Emily's roommate, woke up to silence. Normally, she'd hear Emily getting ready for work, making coffee, or mumbling about being late, but when she glanced over, Emily's bed was still made. At first, Hannah wasn't worried. Maybe Emily had stayed over at a friend's place or crashed at her boyfriend's. But as the morning stretched into afternoon with no texts or calls, a knot of unease settled in her stomach. By evening, panic had taken over. Emily wasn't answering her phone. Her boss at Henderson's bookstore called Hannah, asking if she was sick. She hadn't shown up for her shift. A first for Emily. That was when Hannah called 911. The police initially treated it as a possible misunderstanding. Young women disappeared all the time. Sometimes they ran off, sometimes they just needed space. But Hannah knew Emily. She wasn't the type to just vanish without telling someone. Detective Ryan Calloway arrived at their apartment later that night. He had worked missing persons cases before, but something about Emily's disappearance didn't sit right with him. When he drove to Pine Hollow Diner, he found her car still parked behind the building, untouched. Her last phone signal had pinged near Echo Lake, miles away from her usual routes. And then there was the security footage. Calloway watched as Emily exited the diner, scrolling through her phone. Then, just before she stepped out of view, something caught her attention. Her head snapped up, her body tensed, and she turned sharply toward the darkness beyond the lot. And then, nothing. No more camera footage, no witnesses. Emily Carter had vanished into the night. Detective Ryan Calloway had been with the Redwood Falls Police Department for over a decade, but something about Emily Carter's disappearance unsettled him. Maybe it was the way her car sat untouched behind the Pine Hollow Diner, as if she had planned to come back. Maybe it was the eerie silence of her phone, which had last pinged miles away at Echo Lake, a secluded spot deep within the Tillamook State Forest. Or maybe it was the look on her roommate's face. Pure fear, not just worry. Hannah sat across from him at the station, her hands gripping a disposable coffee cup, knuckles white. She wouldn't just leave, she insisted, shaking her head. Emily wasn't like that. She was predictable. Calloway had heard it before. Friends, family. They always swore their loved ones wouldn't just walk away. But people did. All the time. Still, this felt different. As Calloway dug into the case, Emily's digital footprint was unsettlingly clean. No outgoing calls after she left work, no credit card activity, no social media updates. Like she had simply ceased to exist after stepping out of the diner. Then came the first real lead, the security footage. Calloway watched the grainy video on repeat. Emily exiting the diner, scrolling through her phone. Then, something happened. Her body stiffened, her head snapped up, and she turned sharply, looking toward the darkness beyond the parking lot. She wasn't just glancing around, she was reacting to something. A car? A person? He rewound the tape again. There, just outside the range of the security lights, barely visible, a dark silhouette standing at the edge of the lot. Not moving, just watching. Calloway exhaled slowly, pressing his fingertips together. The last ping of Emily's phone had come from Echo Lake, an area with barely any traffic at night. It wasn't the kind of place someone would just wander into alone. And now, with a shadowy figure lurking in the last known footage of her, one thing was clear. Emily Carter hadn't vanished on her own. Detective Ryan Calloway sat at his desk, flipping through Emily Carter's worn leather journal. The pages smelled of ink and age, the edges frayed from years of use. Hannah had hesitated before handing it over, her fingers lingering on the cover. She always wrote in it, Hannah had said softly. If something was bothering her, it's in there. Calloway skimmed the early entries, typical 20-something thoughts, rants about work, excitement over a new book release, inside jokes scribbled in the margins. But then the tone changed. The handwriting became jagged. the sentences shorter, urgent, and would leave me alone. I keep seeing him everywhere I go. I know what I saw, and I think he knows I saw it too. Calloway's pulse quickened. Who was he? He turned the pages carefully, searching for a name. Instead, he found a date, 3 weeks before Emily vanished. Cross-referencing it with her phone records, he noticed she had made a 911 call that night. The transcript was brief. Dispatcher, 911, what's your emergency? Emily, there's a car parked outside my apartment. It's been there for hours. I think someone's watching me. Dispatcher, can you describe the vehicle? Emily, black SUV, tinted windows, no plates. The call ended shortly after. No follow-up, no suspect. Just an anonymous vehicle lurking in the shadows. Calloway's stomach churned. A black SUV. He rewound the Pine Hollow Diner security footage and watched closely, the figure standing just outside the lights. Had they arrived in a car? Then he saw it. A faint reflection in the corner of the screen. Not enough to make out details, but enough to confirm his suspicion. Someone had been following Emily for weeks. Then the final journal entry. If anything happens to me, check the lake. Calloway grabbed his keys. Echo Lake had been her phone's last ping. If Emily had left a clue, that was where he needed to go. Detective Ryan Calloway drove through the winding roads of Tillamook State Forest, his headlights cutting through the dense fog that clung to the towering pines. Echo Lake was still miles away, but his gut told him he was closing in on something big. Emily Carter had been afraid of someone. She had written about it. She had called 911 about it, and yet no one had taken her seriously. Until now. Back at the station, Calloway had pulled her work schedule from the diner and compared it with local surveillance footage. A disturbing pattern emerged. Each night, a black SUV had been seen near Pine Hollow Diner. Never parked too close, never obvious, but always there, waiting. Someone had been stalking her, and Calloway had a strong suspicion about who. He pulled into the gas station just off Route 22, the last stop before the road to Echo Lake turned to gravel. The place was deserted except for the clerk, a young guy scrolling through his phone behind the counter. Calloway approached, flashing his badge. The clerk barely looked up. No, just truckers and the occasional lost camper. Calloway pulled out his phone, showing a blurry frame from the security footage. The black SUV, headlights dimmed, parked just beyond the diner. You ever seen this car around? The clerk squinted, then nodded. Yeah, a few nights ago, guy came in, bought smokes and coffee, real quiet, looked kinda off. Off how? The clerk shrugged. Just wrong, like he was trying too hard to act normal. Calloway's pulse quickened. Did you catch his name, credit card, anything? The clerk hesitated, then reached under the counter, pulling out an old receipt. Calloway's eyes locked onto the name scrawled at the top. Lucas Grady. A handyman. Lived alone on the outskirts of town. No criminal record, but something about him had always felt off. Emily had written that she kept seeing the same man everywhere. Now Calloway had a name to match the shadow. He folded the receipt, jaw tightening. If Lucas Grady had anything to do with Emily's disappearance, he wouldn't be hiding for much longer. Detective Ryan Calloway gripped the steering wheel as his SUV sped down the dirt road toward Echo Lake. The trees loomed tall and dense on either side, their dark silhouettes flickering in his headlights. Every instinct in his body screamed that he was running out of time. Lucas Grady's name had been on that gas station receipt. A handyman, a quiet guy, the kind of person who blended into the background, who no one really noticed. But Emily had noticed him. She had written about him in her journal. Go and leave me alone. Her phone had last pinged near Echo Lake, and Calloway had a sickening feeling that she was still out there. His radio crackled. Detective, backup is 10 minutes out. He didn't have 10 minutes. The gravel road ended, forcing him to continue on foot. Gun drawn, flashlight in hand, he pushed through the dense underbrush, moving swiftly toward the water. The night air was thick with damp earth and pine, the only sound his own breathing. Until he heard it. A muffled cry. Calloway froze, heart pounding. The sound was coming from a run-down hunting cabin just ahead, its wooden planks rotting, windows dark. He moved closer, careful with every step. The front door was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was stale. The beam of his flashlight swept across the dust-covered floor, the overturned furniture, and then movement. In the corner, tied to a chair, Emily Carter. Her eyes widened as she saw him, her mouth gagged with a dirty cloth. Tears streaked her face. She was alive. Before he could reach her, a figure lunged from the shadows. Lucas Grady. The two men crashed to the ground, Calloway barely dodging the knife aimed at his throat. Grady fought like a man who had nothing left to lose, his grip strong, his eyes wild. But Calloway had something stronger, purpose. A well-placed punch sent Grady sprawling. Within seconds, Calloway had him pinned, cuffs snapping around his wrists. Emily sobbed as Calloway untied her restraints. "You're safe now?" he whispered, his voice steady, reassuring. For the first time in days, Emily Carter knew she was going to make it out alive. The flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars cast eerie shadows across the trees surrounding Echo Lake. The once isolated hunting cabin was now swarming with officers, paramedics, and crime scene investigators. Detective Ryan Calloway stood near the cabin's entrance, watching as Lucas Grady, now handcuffed and bloodied, was shoved into the back of a squad car. His face remained eerily blank, as if he knew this moment had been coming all along. Calloway clenched his jaw. Men like Grady thrived in the shadows, preying on those who never saw them coming. But not this time. Not Emily Carter. Emily sat on the open tailgate of an ambulance wrapped in a thick blanket. The medics had checked her for injuries, bruises, dehydration, exhaustion. But she was alive, shaken but alive. When Calloway approached, she looked up, her eyes still clouded with fear. But when she spoke, her voice was stronger than he expected. "I thought I was going to die in there." Calloway exhaled, crouching to meet her gaze. "You fought to survive. That's what matters." Emily swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the blanket. "He said no one would come looking for me." Her voice wavered, but there was defiance beneath it. "He was wrong." Calloway nodded. "Yeah, he was." Hannah arrived moments later, sprinting through the police barricade before anyone could stop her. The second she saw Emily, she broke down in tears, throwing her arms around her best friend. The scene was chaotic, but as Calloway stepped away, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. This case was over, but he knew the scars would remain. For Emily, for Hannah, even for himself. Later, as Calloway drove back toward town, he pulled over near a ridge overlooking Echo Lake. The moonlight shimmered on the water's surface, still and peaceful, so different from the darkness it had concealed. He knew there would be more cases, more missing people, more monsters lurking in the dark. But tonight, one girl had made it home. And sometimes that was enough.